I still remember the sound my truck tires made when I pulled into the driveway that Tuesday evening because it was the last normal thing that happened that day. Everything after that felt wrong. If you've ever walked onto your property and instantly known something was missing before your brain could even figure out what it was, then you know exactly the feeling I'm talking about. It hits you in the chest first, then your eyes start searching for an answer. Mine landed on an empty patch of sky where a tree had stood for nearly 3 decades. Not a broken branch, not storm damage. The whole thing was gone. Just a stump, a pile of fresh sawdust, and deep tire tracks cutting across the grass like scars. For a second, I honestly thought I was looking at the wrong yard. Then I remembered I only own one house. The tree was gone, and my neighbor had done it. My name is Ryan Mercer, and until all this happened, I thought I had a pretty good understanding of the people who lived around me. I had spent 28 years in that neighborhood outside Lake Ashton, a quiet little community where most folks waved when they drove by and where nothing especially dramatic ever seemed to happen. I bought that house when I was 32 years old. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't big, but it was mine. The first summer after moving in, I planted an oak sapling near the back corner of the property. Back then it barely reached my shoulder. My daughter Emma helped me dig the hole. She was 8 years old and spent most of the afternoon covered in dirt while insisting she was doing all the important work. Every family photo from those years seems to include that tree somewhere in the background. Birthday parties, barbecues, graduation pictures, even the photo from the day Emma left for college. The oak kept growing while life kept moving. By the time this story starts, it was huge, tall enough to shade half my patio during the hottest part of summer, strong enough to survive every storm that rolled through our county. It wasn't just a tree anymore. It was part of the property, part of the memories, part of the reason the backyard felt like home. Now, on the other side of the fence lived a man named Travis Cole. Travis moved in around 6 years before all this happened. If you've ever had a neighbor who always seemed to be competing in a contest nobody else knew existed, that's probably the best way I can describe him. Every project had to be bigger. Every purchase had to be newer. Every conversation somehow circled back to how successful he was. He wasn't openly hostile, not at first, but there was always something underneath. A little arrogance, a little entitlement, the kind of guy who asked questions only so he could interrupt your answer. We got along well enough. Neighborhood barbecue conversations, the occasional wave, nothing more than that. Looking back, I can see signs I ignored. He complained about property lines. He complained about drainage. He complained about views, especially views. His backyard faced a small pond beyond our properties, and he seemed obsessed with seeing every square inch of it. One summer evening a couple years earlier, he pointed toward my oak and joked, "One day I'm going to get rid of that thing and finally enjoy the scenery." I laughed because normal people don't cut down trees that belong to someone else. Turns out I gave him too much credit. The day I found the stump, I walked straight across the yard and knocked on his door. He answered holding a glass of iced tea like we were about to discuss football scores. I didn't waste time. "What happened to my tree?" I asked. He took a sip, looked past me toward the empty space, and shrugged. Actually shrugged. "Oh, that. I had it removed." I stared at him. "You what?" "Relax," he said. "It was practically on the property line anyway." "No, it wasn't." "Close enough." Then came the part I'll never forget. He smiled. Not a nervous smile. Not an apologetic smile. A satisfied smile. Now we've both got a better view of the pond. For a few seconds, I couldn't even respond. My brain was trying to process the fact that another adult human being had just admitted to destroying thousands of dollars worth of property and somehow expected gratitude. "You cut down my tree without asking me." I finally said. "You never use that corner of the yard," he replied. I figured it wasn't a big deal. Figured. That was the word he used. Like he borrowed a lawn chair. Like he moved a garden hose. Like 30 years of growth could be replaced with a casual shrug and a dumb smile. I wanted to yell. I wanted to tell him exactly what I thought of him. Instead, I turned around and walked back home because anger has a funny way of making people stupid, and the last thing I wanted was to do something stupid. That night, I dug through every property document I owned. Survey maps, closing paperwork, county records, Around 10 o'clock, I found the original survey. Then I found the updated one from a boundary review completed years later. I spread both across the kitchen table and measured everything twice. The oak wasn't near the property line. It wasn't even close. It sat fully inside my land. There was absolutely no confusion about ownership. None. I remember sitting there staring at those papers while the house stayed completely quiet around me. The more I looked at them, the calmer I became. Not because I felt better, because I realized Travis had made a mistake much bigger than he understood. The next morning, I started documenting everything. Photos, measurements, witness statements from the tree crew's truck being seen at the property. Then I called a certified arborist. 3 days later, he walked the site, studied the stump, took measurements, and gave me a number that made even me blink. When he finished his assessment, he looked up and said, "Your neighbor may want to sit down before he hears this." At that moment, I thought the story was about a tree. I had no idea the tree was only the beginning of the problem, because over the next few weeks, something else would disappear from the landscape along with that oak, and when it did, Travis was finally going to learn that some things are far more valuable than the view behind them. The arborist's name was Harold Benson, a guy who looked like he'd spent more years around trees than people. He wasn't dramatic by nature, which is probably why his reaction stuck with me. Most experts give you numbers, paperwork, maybe a few recommendations. Harold kept staring at the stump like he was reading a crime scene. He walked slow circles around it, occasionally kneeling down to inspect exposed roots, then making notes on a clipboard. Finally, he stood up, brushed dirt off his jeans, and asked a question I wasn't expecting. "How long has this slope drained through here?" I looked toward the back of the property. "As long as I've lived here. 28 years. He nodded. "That's what I thought." Then he explained something that changed the entire direction of the situation. The oak hadn't simply been a tree. It had become part of the land's drainage system. Over decades, its root network had spread through a huge section of soil beneath the surface, absorbing moisture, stabilizing runoff, and slowing water movement from the higher elevation on my side toward the lower ground beyond the fence. In simple terms, the tree had been quietly doing a job nobody noticed because it had always done it well. The moment Travis removed it, that system disappeared. "You're going to want to keep an eye on water movement after the next few storms," Harold said. "Things may change." At the time, I didn't think much about it. My focus remained on the property damage. I filed the paperwork for small claims court. The valuation came back just under $4,000. Not enough to ruin anyone financially, but certainly enough to make a point. I assumed that would be the end of it. I was wrong. About a week later, another issue started bothering me. Without the tree, a section of soil near my foundation stayed damp longer after rainfall. It wasn't flooding, but the pattern had changed. I called a contractor named Miguel Ortega, someone I'd worked with before. Miguel walked the property, studied the grade, and within 10 minutes, he was shaking his head. "That tree was doing more work than people realize," he said. "You lost a major water buffer." He recommended installing a French drain along part of the property line to redirect runoff away from the foundation. Everything would remain entirely on my property. Everything would be permitted and inspected. Nothing about it would affect Travis directly, at least not intentionally. I approved the project. Looking back, that decision became the turning point of the whole story. Construction started the following Monday. Nothing flashy. Atran, gravel, drainage pipa, prupe grading. The kind of work nobody notices unless they know what they're looking at. Travis certainly noticed. He spent half the week standing in his yard, pretending not to watch. Every afternoon, I'd catch him leaning against his fence with crossed arms. Finally, he wandered over. "What's all this?" he asked. "Drainage work. Looks expensive. Less expensive than foundation damage." He glanced at the trench. "Seems unnecessary." I almost laughed. The irony was strong enough to pull a truck. "Funny," I said. "I've become a big fan of protecting my property lately." His expression tightened for a second. He knew exactly what I meant. Neither of us said anything else. The court date was still 6 weeks away. Life moved forward. Summer rolled along. Neighbors mowed lawns. Kids rode bicycles through the cul-de-sac. The world kept turning. Then came the rain. Not a hurricane. Not some biblical disaster. Just a heavy summer storm system that parked itself over our area for nearly 2 days. The kind where the forecast keeps promising it'll move out tomorrow, then tomorrow becomes tomorrow again. The first day, I watched from my kitchen window while sheets of rain rolled across the backyard. Everything looked normal. The French drain worked exactly as designed. Water moved away from the foundation and disappeared underground through the drainage route Miguel had built. Problem solved, or so I thought. The second day was when things got interesting. Around lunchtime, I stepped onto my covered patio and noticed something unusual beyond the fence. The low corner of Travis's yard looked darker than normal. By evening, it wasn't just darker. It was holding water. Not much at first, just shallow pooling. Still, something about it made me pause. The next morning, the rain finally stopped. Sunlight returned. Most yards in the neighborhood started drying almost immediately. Travis's didn't. Water remained trapped across a large section of his backyard. The newly seeded grass he'd planted that spring had turned into a soggy brown sponge. Every step left footprints. By afternoon, several puddles had merged into one broad muddy area, stretching nearly 20 feet. I won't lie. Part of me noticed the irony. The same corner of the yard that suddenly enjoyed a clearer view of the pond now looked like part of the pond. But I wasn't celebrating. Honestly, I was curious more than anything. Then things escalated. 3 days later, Travis knocked on my front door. I opened it and immediately saw the difference in his face. The confidence was gone. The smugness was gone. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely worried. "Hey," he said, "you got a minute?" I stepped outside. He pointed toward his backyard. "Something's wrong with the drainage. Looks that way. It never used to do this." I nodded. "Nope." He waited for more. I didn't give him any. Finally, he said, "Do you think that drain you installed caused it?" There it was. The question. The accusation wrapped inside a request for help. "No." He answered calmly. The drain redirects water away from my foundation. It's functioning exactly how it was designed. Well, something changed. I looked past him toward the standing water. Then I looked back. Actually, several things changed. His jaw tightened. "What's that supposed to mean?" I held eye contact for a few seconds. Gravity hasn't changed. Rainfall hasn't changed. The slope hasn't changed. He already knew where I was going. "Ryan." The tree changed. Silence. The kind that lands heavy between two people. Travis looked away first. "Come on." "No," I said. "You come on. You cut down a 30-year-old oak without permission. Did you ever stop to think it might have been doing something besides blocking your view?" He didn't answer. Because he hadn't. People like Travis rarely think beyond the inconvenience directly in front of them. If something bothers them, they remove it. Problem solved. Except real life isn't that simple. Systems exist. Consequences exist. Remove one piece, and sometimes the entire balance shifts. He left without another word. Over the next 2 weeks, the situation got worse. Every rainfall recreated the same problem. Water collected. Grass died. Mud spread. The affected section of his yard grew larger each time. Neighbors started noticing. Neighborhood conversations began. One afternoon, I overheard 2 retirees discussing it while walking their dogs. Another neighbor joked that Travis might need a fishing license to cross his backyard. Word traveled fast. Travis became increasingly frustrated. Contractors visited his property. Surveyors appeared. One drainage company spent nearly 3 hours inspecting the area before leaving. None of them could change the fundamental reality. The yard sat downhill from mine. The tree that once absorbed and regulated thousands of gallons of water throughout the year no longer existed. And the person responsible for removing it happened to be the same person now dealing with the consequences. Through all of this, I never once taunted him, never once rubbed it in. As satisfying as some people might imagine that would be, I didn't need to. Reality was already making the point better than I ever could. Then, about 10 days before our court hearing, something happened that told me Travis finally understood the position he was in. Because for the first time since this whole mess started, he stopped trying to defend what he'd done and started trying to make the problem disappear before a judge had the chance to hear the full story. About 10 days before the court hearing, I noticed something I hadn't seen once since this whole mess began. Travis was avoiding me. For weeks he'd been outside constantly, supervising contractors, pacing around his muddy backyard, making phone calls that never seemed to improve his situation. Suddenly, he vanished. His truck was still there every evening, but whenever I stepped outside, he somehow managed to be somewhere else. At first I thought maybe he was embarrassed. Then I realized something else was happening. He was talking to lawyers. The clue came from a certified letter that arrived at my house asking for copies of the arborist report and property survey through a formal request. That told me somebody had finally explained the situation to him in language he understood. Not neighbor language. Not common sense language. Expensive legal language. The kind that comes with hourly billing rates. A few days later, I was trimming some shrubs near the driveway when an unfamiliar sedan pulled up. A man in a navy suit stepped out and introduced himself as Travis's attorney. He was polite, professional, and noticeably more respectful than his client had ever been. We spoke for maybe 15 minutes. He asked questions about the timeline, the reports, and the photographs. I answered everything honestly. Then he sighed and said something that almost made me laugh. "Mr. Mercer, my client feels there may have been misunderstandings on both sides." Misunderstandings. That's always an interesting word. A misunderstanding is ordering coffee and getting tea. A misunderstanding is showing up on Tuesday when the appointment was Wednesday. Hiring a crew to remove someone else's 30-year-old tree isn't a misunderstanding. It's a decision. I smiled and told him exactly that. He nodded in a way that suggested he agreed, but wasn't allowed to say so. Before leaving, he asked whether I would consider settling before the hearing. I told him I'd consider listening. That's all. 3 days later, the offer arrived. Full payment. Every dollar from the arborist valuation. Filing fees. Assessment costs. Everything. No argument. No negotiation. No conditions attached. Just a check and a settlement agreement. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the paperwork for a long time. Not because I was surprised. By then the outcome seemed obvious. What surprised me was how quickly confidence disappears when consequences finally show up. 6 weeks earlier, Travis had stood on his porch smiling about my tree. Now he was paying thousands of dollars to avoid explaining that decision in front of a judge. I signed the agreement the next morning. The case was over before it officially began. You'd think that would be the end of the story. In a legal sense, it was. In a human sense, not quite. About a week after the settlement, I was sitting on my patio early one evening watching the sun drop behind the trees on the far side of the pond. Ironically, there was now a much better view than before. Travis walked over carrying 2 bottles of beer. For a second, I honestly thought I was imagining it. He stopped near the fence and held 1 bottle up. "Peace offering?" he asked. I considered saying no. Maybe part of me should have. Instead, I walked over and accepted it. We stood there quietly for a moment. The air felt different. Not friendly exactly. Just honest. Finally, he cleared his throat. "I screwed up." Those 3 words were the closest thing to an apology I was ever going to get. "Yeah," I said. "You did." He nodded. "I thought it was just a tree." There it was. The entire story distilled into 1 sentence. Not arrogance. Not malice. Not even greed. Just a failure to understand the value of something because it didn't belong to him. I took a sip and looked toward the empty patch where the oak used to stand. "Most expensive view you ever bought?" I asked. For the first time in months, he laughed. "Not even close. The drainage estimates are worse." We both laughed at that. Maybe because it was true. Maybe because after everything, reality had developed a sense of humor. The standing water problem never fully disappeared. He eventually spent a substantial amount of money redesigning portions of his yard. New grading, additional drainage work, more landscaping. Every contractor basically told him the same thing in different words. Removing a mature tree changes things, sometimes permanently. The following spring, I planted another oak. It wasn't large, barely taller than I was. Some people thought I was trying to replace what I'd lost. The truth is a little different. You don't replace a 30-year-old tree. You start over. That's all. One afternoon, my daughter Emma came to visit and saw the new sapling. She smiled and said, "Think you'll be around long enough to see it get that big?" I told her I hope so. Then I added, "And if I'm not, maybe somebody else will." We stood there for a while looking at it. Small trees are funny. They don't look important. They don't look powerful. They certainly don't look like something capable of affecting property values, drainage systems, neighborhood disputes, court settlements, or human relationships. Yet somehow they do. Looking back now, years later, the thing I remember most isn't the lawsuit. It isn't the check. It isn't even the muddy disaster that turned Travis's backyard into a cautionary tale. What I remember is how quickly people assume they understand the full impact of something when they're only seeing the surface. Travis saw a blocked view. I saw a tree. The arborist saw an environmental system. The contractors saw drainage infrastructure. The courts saw property rights. Everyone was looking at the same oak and seeing something different. Maybe that's true about a lot of conflicts. We focus so much on the thing directly in front of us that we never bother asking what invisible job it might be doing. Sometimes the consequences arrive immediately. Sometimes they take weeks. Sometimes they take years. But they almost always arrive. And that's the part of this story people argue about whenever I tell it. Some think I should have been angrier. Others think I should have forgiven him sooner. A few people even say the muddy backyard was karma. Personally, I don't know. I never set out to punish him. I protected my property, followed the law, and let reality handle the rest. Maybe that's justice. Maybe it's coincidence. Maybe it's something in between. But I'd love to hear what you think. If your neighbor destroyed something valuable on your property without permission, would you have gone straight to court, tried to work it out privately, or done something completely different? And do you think what happened afterward was simple cause and effect? Or was it karma finally catching up? Let me know in the comments, because I'm willing to bet this story is going to split opinions right down the middle.